Welcome to part 2 of the Confidential Bulletin podcast, where we're having a conversation with Benjamin Ebbink, who was the chief consultant of the California Assembly Labor and Employment Committee, and David Lanier, who was labor secretary for then Governor Jerry Brown.
And now for a word from our sponsor.
I've noticed the flowers are blooming and the bees are buzzing. That's great, but it also means allergy season is upon us. Not feeling like driving to the pharmacy to pick up those meds? Don't bother. Get your meds delivered. DoorDash, your door to more. Download the DoorDash app now to get almost anything delivered. Must be 21 and older to order alcohol. Drink responsibly. Alcohol available only in select markets.
Do either of you recall when you started, I guess, Jerry Brown was hearing about the abuses and, certainly, Ben, you were hearing about it. Did it happen in the immediate aftermath of the signing of the bill, or did it take a while for the trial lawyers to figure out how to game this?
From my perspective, it did take a while. I didn't hear immediate concerns. Now, working in the legislature, you're a little insulated from the real world sometimes. So it's often, a little bit difficult to get a grasp of what's happening on the street. But it took some time. I think that's common with a lot of statutes. Statute goes into effect, takes a couple of years for employers to figure out, for plaintiff attorneys to figure out where the violations are. Plaintiff attorneys are waiting for violations to pile up for the statutory period. So they want to, give it a couple of years, and then I can go back and sue for the last few years of damages. So it did take some time. I think it was only when I really started hearing directly from business owners. We had business advocates. I think Republicans ran a bill every year to repeal PAGA, just never went anywhere. And you were talking to lobbyists all the time, which are fine, nice people. I'm a lobbyist now, great people. But when I really sat down with business owners and heard them describe the type of things they were being sued for, and when they really felt they had no choice, they were presented an analysis from their attorney saying, they kind of got you here. Technically, you violated this pay stub provision or this other provision, and you're looking at potentially $5 million in PAGA penalties for the, poor employer who's like, this is not a violation where I was cheating the worker, where I deprived them of wages or stole their wages or anything like that. This is a technical violation. I missed some box to check. And so they get faced with this. The lawyer has to do their job and say, worst case scenario here, you could be looking at $5 million. So settle this thing for $1 million. To a small business owner to have to settle and, pay over $1 million for a violation where nobody was actually harmed. When I started hearing those stories and started reviewing lawsuits and complaints that alleged those type of facts, is when I started to get a better picture of, what I think was really going on out there in the abuse. Now, I'm not going to say PAGA is never used for legitimate purposes. There are examples of cases where employees are grievously harmed, and sometimes intentionally so. And those employees should be compensated, and that employer also has to face some punishment for that. And that's the purpose of civil penalties and the enforcement of those penalties. But in reality, with the way we're seeing PAGA play out over the last, decade is a lot of, lawsuits over hyper-technical violations of the code where there's no harm to the employee. And so the employer faces an existential threat of potential liability, or I could go out of business. So I will settle to make this thing go away. And that's once I started hearing those cases and seeing those cases and looking business owners in the eye, is when I think I really got a sense of what was happening in the real world when it comes to PAGA.
Do you remember what year, around what was it, 2007, 8, 9?
I want to say it was later than that. I think it was after Governor Brown came into office, or maybe shortly before, is that, I really started having those opportunities to hear from business owners directly. And I had so many just look me in the eye and say, look, we want to follow the law. We want two things. Number one, clearly tell us what we have to do. Just tell us what we have to do in a way we can understand it, and we'll do it. Don't make it complicated. Don't make it vague. Don't leave us on our own to figure out the guidance. Give us clear direction. You need to do this, and we'll do it. And if we don't, if we make a mistake, tell us and let us fix it, and we'll do it. We'll fix it. We'll go back. We'll make the worker whole. If it involved wages, we will fix it. Just don't sue us. Don't make us spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney's fees and award a settlement. We just want to know what the law is, and we want to, if we make a mistake, please just tell us. We will fix it, and we will go back and make it right. We just don't want to be sued. And I just started hearing that over and over and over again, primarily from small businesses, and it just really resonated.
It's I guess what we haven't talked about, and I found it interesting when you look at the bill that created the law, SB 796, by then Senator Joe Dunn, who was a pretty potent trial lawyer before he was elected to the Senate. And then you look at the record. I don't recall seeing, the trial lawyers being too, out front on this when it was being, when it was moving through the legislature. And of course, maybe they didn't need to take a position because it maybe would look bad that they were trying to enact a law that was going to enrich them. And maybe all they needed was Joe Dunn to do their bidding for them. But it's interesting that, it seems as though the biggest protectors, of this law, certainly beneficiaries, are the trial lawyers. And I think a lot of people are coming to the realization, across various interests, that the workers are the ones who are getting screwed here. I mean, David, do you have anything on that? The workers are the ones who are actually ending up with pennies on the dollar, and the trial lawyers are the ones that are, making Porsche payments.
Well, I can add a little color to a couple of those things, Jot. One, I'll say the first year that we had a full year recording of the settlements under PAGA was 2017. And the number of settlements tripled from 2017 to 2021, 2022. And they've continued to accelerate. So I think it took a long time for word to get out. Initially, the firms and types of attorneys that were bringing these suits, it was pretty specialized. And then we heard anecdotally at different conferences for consumer attorneys and plaintiffs bars, there would be presentations about how to bring these suits. And I think you have to also overlay what was happening, and I'm not an expert in this part of it, but on class action reform and what decisions were being made around having to certify classes and the difficulty in getting bringing a class action suit, relatively speaking, to a PAGA action where there's no class certification requirement. It's very easy to bring the case. And the names of the firms that were playing and participating in PAGA actions began to change, and you saw some bigger players. And I do want to say, to be fair to Ben's point, I've seen plenty of legitimate PAGA suits. For the most part, I don't think they're suits that the state couldn't bring and handle themselves, which is my personal opinion. But in 2014, 2015, I went out and did what Ben's talking about and met with groups of business people who had been sued under PAGA and some under the unfair competition statute, and heard the stories. And that's what really, prompted the governor's demand and our effort to get some reforms we tried in 2015 and eventually got it in 2016. So those stories of what they were being sued for really resonated. And it was, we're 12 years after enactment of the statute by then. It took a while to develop, but the trend has been clear. The tool has been used. I use tool, air quote on tools. The tool PAGA has been used increasingly since that time. The number of notices is up. The numbers of settlements are up. One thing we can't measure is the demand letter euphemistic demand letter, employer side, we call them a shakedown letter, that come before a formal PAGA action. We know those are out there as well. So when I say businesses have paid more than $8 billion in settlements, it doesn't capture any of settlement that was before a formal PAGA notice was filed with the state.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And speaking as somebody who works for a labor and employment firm, we see these all the time. It's a demand letter, it's a copy of the draft PAGA notice, and it's a copy of the draft complaint of the lawsuit. And it says, we are going to file this PAGA notice and thereafter file the lawsuit unless you come to the table and negotiate a settlement. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes the employer makes a judgment call and says, I'm going to try to resolve this thing, save my expenses on both on my end and any settlement, and come to the table. And that's all not quantifiable. That doesn't show up in any measurable way that you can measure how many of those settlements occur.
And then, Jot, just to get back to, I think, your main question, outcomes from workers under PAGA. I have now participated for most of the last 5 years since I left the secretary position with the former director of the Department of Industrial Relations and her partner in doing public record acts requests and compiling the settlement numbers that I've been using today and looking at what are the outcomes for workers. And we started with a very small sample size, and we've now, in the latest report that just came out and the Fixed PAGA Coalition has actually disseminated, what we've seen consistently is that workers wait longer under a PAGA action compared to an action that's handled by the state. It's a year longer on average. So it takes an extra year to get paid. And what we've seen also consistently is, on average, they get half as much award. So they get less money and they wait longer, which is why I've been public about supporting fixing PAGA and bolstering the enforcement from the state, because when the state handles the cases, they do a good job. And I know from firsthand experience that they're willing to work with employers when there are mistakes that are innocent. They're also willing to hammer employers when they're not. And that's, it's an important distinction. Those distinctions don't get made in a PAGA suit. It's the calculation that Ben's talking about. How much will this cost me to defend? And what is my potential liability across every single employee? Because they're going to allege if there's one violation, the practice is to allege that it occurred for every employee over every pay period for 3 years. And either the penalty in the statute now or the PAGA penalty will apply. They both apply. You stack them up. And employers are facing just multi-million-dollar threats. And they're writing the checks. They've written, I'm pretty confident we're at 10 billion and counting if we had the latest data.
Yeah, well, the data that you were so central in compiling for many in the the employer community, David, was eye-opening for many. The restaurant industry certainly has been a victim of the abuses of this law, and you've broken it down by industry sector. And it feels like we're the top target as an industry, because I'm hearing from every type of restaurant owner, big, small, medium, that are just, giving me stories about the impact this is having, not just on their business, but, and the fact that the employees really are not really the winners here, and it's the trial lawyers. And restaurants aren't even in the top 3 in terms of industries being targeted. It's retail, grocers are probably, I think, the top, almost $1 billion in terms of the record requests and the recording you've done. It's nuts.
Yeah, I've got the latest restaurant numbers in front of me since we're talking to your members today. It's just under $500 million that we've recorded in settlements. The average settlement amount is over $800,000. Average attorney fee on that $800,000 is $300,000. So that you can't pay those kind of attorney fees and have the workers end up with as much money. There's a bunch of other costs in there as well. So it's a huge amount of money, and it's getting worse, not better.
Well, on that point, be sure to go to fixpaga.com and make your voice heard and stay engaged. I think you'll find that website helpful in terms of what you can do and how you can help us achieve the reform. We're almost up to an hour here, and I really appreciate both your time. It's been excellent having you on, and a fun conversation and depressing at the same time. But I just, as we close out, you two, you're not household names, but you are certainly fixtures in the California, public policy and political landscape. So we're honored to have you. But given the time that you've spent on the inside, observing and being part of the sausage making process and working for some colorful and interesting figures, you got to give me a story. I mean, I think before we got on, Ben, you had threatened to bring up a John Burton story. And certainly, David, you've worked for one of the most charismatic political figures that we've seen in this country. So give me your.
I'll give you a quick John Burton story. So, the PAGA law, as originally passed, had almost none of the procedural safeguards we're talking about today. Like when PAGA was passed, you didn't even have to send a letter over to the labor agency. You could just go ahead and file your lawsuit. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the political dynamics and the legislative rules were different back then. Back then, you needed 54 votes to pass a budget. So you remember those days, Jot. Every summer, we would have a lengthy budget delay, usually about a month or so. And it was this chess game. And the Republicans would have a laundry list of 10 or 15 policy changes they wanted in exchange, for going up on a budget vote. And back in those days, the legislative staff didn't get paid when there was no budget. So we were all sweating. The credit union would pay our salary for us in the meantime, but it was a difficult dynamic. So I remember being in a room. It was, a month into a budget stalemate. We're sitting in a room looking at the laundry list of Republican proposals. And 10 of us in a room. John Burton comes in and he's like, I'm only going to get this budget if we fix that fucking PAGA law. So I need you to do whatever it takes to fix that law so I can get a budget and we can get the hell out of here. And so that's how we got the Joe Dunn bill from the next year. I think it was SB 1809 that made some modest changes. You had to send a notice to the labor agency and things like that. And again, that's a function of, we wouldn't have gotten that if we were just pushing that on our own, but it was because of the political dynamic and you needed those Republican votes to get a budget. And John Burton was fit to be tied after sitting here sweating in a Sacramento summer for a month when he didn't have to. So he was pissed and he instructed everybody, you will fix this and do what it takes to get those votes to go up. And that's how we got those very modest initial PAGA reforms the year after it was passed.
John Burton stories.
Sorry about the French words for all the listeners.
For every John Burton story has at least 2 or 3 F-bombs in it. I mean, that's what makes John Burton stories so fun to listen to. David, give it to us. Give us a good Jerry Brown story.
I don't know that I can top a good John Burton F-bomb. I mean, it's a true story because he used the F-bomb. That's how it's the signature for John. Yeah, I don't have one to top that, Jot. I already told it, once on our conversation today, is Jerry Brown not wanting to sign labor code changes because it was going to make the sue your boss bill worse. And, that was part of my message back to labor when we got the few reforms that we did get in 2016 was we had to have, the governor wanted some fixes and we had to have them. I mean, I will say I sat in the labor agency conference room with a group of attorneys brought by the PAGA supporters and arguing over whether we could require more information on the notices and whether we could review settlements and what had to be filed with the state. And all of them insisting that up was down and down was up, as Ben has said, and everything was fine. And so then I had my team pass out examples of the notices that were being filed. And much to the chagrin of the paid lobbyists who were in the room on behalf of the trial attorneys, the actual practicing attorneys looked at them and gasped and said, these are terrible. Like, this isn't acceptable. So that's really how we got some of the notice fixes, is their own constituents and members came in and said, yeah.
I'll give you one more story, Jot. It's very recent. This was during COVID. Everybody was working from home. So Governor Newsom, this proposal actually came from him, was to say, okay, if you get sued for a meal period violation when the employee's been working from home and you as the employer, how can you really monitor that, whether they took it or not? Let's say there's no PAGA just for that type of violation in that case. You can sue for the missed meal period, get your 1 hour of wages, but we're just not going to put a PAGA penalty on top of that because it's COVID. Everybody's working from home. How are you supposed to monitor that? So I had to go before the Assembly Labor Committee and present that bill, thank the governor for bringing it. And I don't think the bill even got a vote in the committee. It wouldn't even get a motion in a second. And the labor folks opposed the bill and said, if we pass this bill, it would take away a right that workers fought and died for. And I was incredulous. A PAGA penalty for a missed meal period when you're working remotely from home and the employer has no way to verify whether you've taken your meal period or not. We couldn't even get that exception to PAGA. We couldn't even get a motion in a second. And that was, 2020, 2021. Something like that, not 10 years ago, not 15 years ago. So just sort of illustrate the uphill battle for any meaningful reform.
Benjamin Ebbink, partner with Fisher Phillips Law Firm and the Sacramento and DC offices, and co-chair of the Government Relations Practice Group. And David Lanier, principal at Lanier Consulting. I appreciate you two spending an hour with us today, and thank you for your time.
And now for a word from the California Restaurant Association's legal partners.
All right, I'm Alden Parker. I'm with Fisher Phillips. I'm co-chair of our National Hospitality Group. I'm also a proud member of CRA and part of their legal center. And this is Ask CRA.
Operating a restaurant is tough. What's keeping you up at night? If you have questions you would like us to answer, please submit them on our website at calrest.org/ASK. That's calrest.org/ask. Your question might be answered here on a future episode of Confidential Bulletin. Our Legal Center partners are a valuable membership benefit. Are you taking advantage of your 15 minutes of free legal advice every month from one of our employment law attorneys? Be sure to call in to our CRA helpline for help today.
All right, welcome back. I have another question from one of our members through Ask CRA. This time I'm asked, do I have to provide employees with vacation and sick pay? Now, here in California currently, sick pay is mandatory. You have to provide paid sick leave. It is up to 40 hours per year now that people have to pay under the California law. There can be more under a local ordinance. And so you have to understand what your local ordinance provides for sick pay. Currently in California, vacation is not mandated. You do not have to provide vacation, but it is a benefit you provide. And it's important to know that if you provide vacation, there are certain rules in California about how that can go. We don't allow use it or lose it vacation policies, for instance. And so while you don't have to provide it, you have to pay attention to the rules if you do, and it'll be important for you to understand those. So I hope this information is useful to you. Don't forget to put your Ask CRA question into us so that we or the other legal partners here at CRA can go ahead and answer these questions for you.
We hope you enjoyed Confidential Bulletin. Your membership helps us advocate statewide on your behalf. You can also access tools and education that can help you be a better and more profitable operator while connecting with more than 22,000 like-minded hospitality professionals just like you. If you are not a member, join us. Check us out at calrest.org. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or professional advice. The views expressed in this podcast may not be those of the host or the management.